The audience was baffled by this new modern contrivance, and they came to look and to marvel.
And most of the time, when you take a perceptual or motor system outside of its normal range of operation, things go south. Things explode.
So this is what could have happened. You're looking at a shot of a train arriving at the station, and there's a cut to a completely different shot. And it's conceivable, given the nature of the human brain, that the whole audience gets seasick and throws up.
Oh, I gotta say, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall watching this scene unfold and maybe some chunder on the floor. Also, people were afraid to get hit by a train, and that would have been hilarious in and of itself. Welcome to the Cinema Psych Podcast, the podcast where psychology meets film. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Swan, and in this episode, we are going to get at that tagline, where psychology meets film. We're going to do a little different of an episode today. This one's not about a fictional Hollywood film, but rather a documentary on how fictional Hollywood films work so well. And we're going to focus on one feature of filmmaking, and that is editing, cutting, as it is referred to colloquially, because of old film being cut at a certain point and then stitched together to make a seamless one reel, or multiple reels, of course, but like a one line of frames. The film today is going to be The Cinema Within. The Cinema Within. This film was released in 2024, and we are going to speak with the filmmaker, Chad Freidrichs. He's going to join me in a couple of minutes. So this film, with the tagline, An Inquiry into the Deepest of Cinematic Mysteries, a mystery, so to speak, that has been around since the late 1800s, when film was created, from motion pictures, right? From Edward Muybridge's showing that a horse does, at one point in its gallop, have all hooves off the ground, to now, right? We're over 130 years later. We have still a mystery, so to speak, on why film editing is so amazing and does not result in the little stinger of people throwing up because there is motion. Yeah, sure, some super sensitive people, motion sickness, will typically have issues with high motion films. Like, I know my mom really did not like the second and third Bourne trilogy movies because they were directed by Paul Greengrass, and he likes to do shaky cam. He likes to do handheld shaky cam editing and action because, you know, you're a person in the mix and it's like, and she can't do that. She's not a fan of it. She doesn't mind the first one because that was a Doug Liman movie and it was a completely different way of filmmaking. But, you know, Paul Greengrass, he has his way, and, you know, it leads to just people who are like, eh. So, you know, the vast majority of filmgoers can handle the edits, right? And so in this episode, what Chad and I are going to do is explore the documentary's thesis, which is how film editing flows from a human perceptual universal. At least so far as we know, there's some interesting science that is discussed in this movie where maybe it's not so much a universal unless you are particularly familiar with films. So we'll explore that. Okay. So as I said, Chad Freidrichs, director of this movie, he also does pretty much all of the editing. He'll talk about his process in this episode. He did all of the interviewing and with several partners produced it as well. So he is a documentary filmmaker. The folks that are in this movie all are themselves. They're interviewed. Sermin Ildirar is a important voice in this, and we'll definitely talk about her. She's a psychologist and really film psychologist, we'll say, in Europe. Walter Murch is in this film. You heard his voice a little bit in The Stinger. He is a Oscar-winning film editor. Tamami Nakano is a researcher featured in this film. Jeff Sachs, Tim Smith, Dan Levin, David Bordwell. Cody Proctor plays an interesting role in this. We'll get into that. Ed Hansen does a lot of pantomiming. Not friend of the show, Ed Hansen. That is Hansen, as opposed to this Ed Hansen, Hanson. And then Cliff Froelich is a button pusher, as happens in the film. So lovely editing that goes on in this documentary. Chad did a great job, and we'll explore what his process is in editing and all of that. I'm excited to get into the science of this, the cognitive science of this, and explore what made him decide to do a documentary about a cognitive science principle like perception and the fact that we can see movies from individually still frames that are moving at a consistent speed. So that's going to be a short introduction because let's just get right into it. My guest host today is Chad Freidrichs. Chad is an independent documentary filmmaker. Prior to The Cinema Within, the film that we're talking about today, he directed and produced 4 feature-length documentary films, including Jandek on Corwood, which came out in 2003, The Experimental City in 2017, and The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, which came out in 2011. Amongst his filmed honors, Chad's The Pruitt-Igoe Myth was acquired for the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection in 2017 and was on display in MoMA's galleries in New York from 2019 to 2022. Capable, resourceful, and independent, he performs nearly every production task on his films. But he specializes in editing and the creative aspects of post-production, which he loves the most of all, which is my favorite thing to do. So we're going to be the best of friends for this episode. Chad, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alex. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk about post-production with you today.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about post-production because I was so enamored by your editing on The Cinema Within that I do have to find out your process here. But before we jump into the film itself, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on film in general, and what made you decide to get into filmmaking.
Okay. Well, in general, I love films. I actually these days I enjoy making them more than I enjoy watching them. I still enjoy watching them quite a bit, but I spend far, far more of my time by choice actually making them. I prefer the process to actually watching. And I can turn it off, so I can, like everyone else, I can kind of stop critiquing and analyzing and, just kind of enjoy it. I think, I used to teach, and that was one thing that students would always worry about, is that they'd lose the ability to experience a film magically. And so I can still watch a film. But so how I got into it, though, and this is going way back when I didn't have any of those kind of understandings of film, was I was watching in high school. I watched the movie called JFK by Oliver Stone.
Right. Yeah.
And that was the film that made me want to be a filmmaker. So I watched that film and there was something about it where it just made me think, wow, it would be really cool to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I didn't know what was kind of drawing me in. At the time, it was just like, oh, this is a really cool story. And I'm into conspiracy theories to a certain extent because I'm in high school.
Yeah.
And so, like it was just like the story kind of captivated me. But actually, I think on a more fundamental level, what was going on there was I was aware that a film was being constructed in front of me as I was watching it. And I don't mean that it was being made real time, but you could see the seams of the film, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so because the film is so dynamically constructed, it cuts from black and white to color, it puts in video and 16 millimeter film, 35 millimeter, all these different film stocks. It just jumps from place to place to place over and over again. That there's no way you can not understand it as an edited thing. And I'd never understood films as being kind of edited by somebody, as made by somebody, and that was the first time, perhaps quite appropriately, that I identified that would be something that would be really cool to do at 15 years old.
Right. And then, from that editing standpoint here, fast forward, several decades later. Sorry, I don't mean to be aging you that much. Yeah. That you've made this film about editing, right? Which is phenomenal, with, might I say, some great edits within itself. But before we dive into that one, you mentioned teaching. And of course, part of this podcast is to talk about teaching, well, mostly teaching of psychology, but of course, all teachers are welcome in the pedagogy sphere. So what sort of details? How long did you teach for? What sorts of classes did you teach?
Well, so I was a filmmaking teacher at Stevens College in Columbia, Missouri, which is a women's college.
Excellent.
So I taught young women how to make movies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I taught there from 2007 to 2012.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
And
excellent.
And I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed just the process of interaction and seeing light bulbs go off. But it was a really kind of profound change for me in terms of my film practice, because I think I became much more aware of what I was doing. Before I was kind of, working intuitively, but like teaching, you have to explain it to somebody and they figure out a way to make it go wrong somehow. And then you have to diagnose very quickly, like what has gone wrong, and then propose a solution for fixing it,
right?
Or like at least like allow them to find a way of fixing it themselves. And so that, that's kind of when I became much more aware as a filmmaker. I think to for better or worse, it's something that, there's certain elements that working intuitively is great. And I still do that, but I'm much more kind of analytical now in my approach, I think, than I was before going into teaching.
It's has a very similar sound to it to what my research is about, which is, identifying biases. I don't really identify the biases. I'll let other cognitive scientists do that, but like explore mitigation strategies. And a lot of it has to do with shutting down your intuitive mind to allow your analytical mind, so to speak, to take over. And that's a great analogy to what you just described there. And I noticed here in your introduction that you were teaching while also putting together the Pruitt-Igoe myth documentary. So how was that?
Well, it was, I teaching. One of the great things about teaching is that you have that schedule, so I was off on Fridays, and I was off during the summer times and all the breaks. So I was working on Pruitt-Igoe during that time. So I was kind of going back and forth, and I was teaching editing. One of my favorite things ever to have occurred in my life, I think, was when that film actually did like kind of surprisingly well. And it was, at the time so I was teaching a film teaching a class called Advanced Editing.
Mm-hmm.
And back in the day, you would watch movie trailers on iTunes Movies, Apple Movies, right? So you'd watch trailers on iTunes. Mm-hmm. And so while I was teaching that class and teaching students how to make a trailer, my film actually happened to be number 1 on iTunes trailers for that week. And so
That's awesome.
What I did during the class is like, hey, all, let's go to iTunes trailers and check out and see, what the best trailers are right now. So we can kind of get an insight as to what it's like to view a movie trailer and to kind of analyze it. And then what's that movie that's there? It's the Pruitt-Igoe myth. And they're just like absolutely shocked. So that was a really great experience for me. And then, I shared the kind of festival life of the film with them as I was, teaching other courses, and just kind of, like, they, in a way, they helped propel that film to what it became. I think the interaction with my students was something that really informed the overall makeup of that film. And, it's still to this day my most successful film. And so, There's some magic that took place there.
That is a great story. I would love to, if you ever write a book, that is your book right there. That is my time teaching film editing and the shared experience. They were all burgeoning with you. Have you heard of this psychological term, Chad? Burgeoning. No. It's called basking in reflected glory. And it's a social psychological principle where other people feel good when they share the triumphs and successes of somebody else, right? So that was your success, and your students were burgeoning with you. And it's a great story because burgeoning makes the world go round, really, right? It is a underlying aspect, in my view, of kindness, right? Because you watch other people do well and you're like, yes, the whole parents kind of thing, parents watching their kids at sports, all that stuff.
Movies, totally.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
Because what you're looking at is a violent disruption of physical reality. Instantaneously, one picture is replaced by another. And nothing in our day-to-day experience mirrors that.
Which is why, when cinema first emerged, the camera was put on a tripod and you filmed the scene in front. And you minimized the changes from one perspective to another because it was believed that it would be jarring to the viewers. A few years into the 20th century, that assumption is gone. Filmmakers realized that actually, I can cut. Viewers perfectly understand it. And from that moment, cinema took off.
So let's pivot to the cinema within. This is a recent documentary. IMDb lists it as coming out in 2024. So it's recent. It came out and it's got an interesting story. One of the things that researchers like to challenge each other with, especially since the research space is so vast and unrelenting, I suppose, is a good word for it. The challenge is your elevator pitch, right? You've got 30 seconds in an elevator with an unsuspecting person. What do you say to them about your film?
Boy, that's a lot of pressure.
It is. It's what we tell our students when they're doing their research projects. What's your elevator pitch?
Well, what I would say is it's a film about how we understand editing. Editing should be something that should be very difficult to understand, but counterintuitively, it's something that's quite easy to understand. In fact, so easy that we view it almost without even thinking about it. We understand it invisibly in a way. Edits themselves become something that we don't even notice in films. And yet it's a disruption that we should notice. We should absolutely notice it. And yet when you're watching a film, most people don't even realize that there's edits taking place.
Right.
And so it's a film about that idea. Like how is it that editing works? And certain psychologists seem to think that it works because it's in tune with our natural perception.
Sure.
That it's similar enough to the way that we look at the world that we understand it so intuitively. And if that's the case, then people who have never seen films before should be able to understand an edited film without ever seeing edits before.
Yeah. And I like you mentioned that people don't really know that edits are happening until something is unedited, like a oneer, for example. A lot of filmmakers are using oneers these days, which is a long, unedited sequence. And you see them in TV shows, you see them in movies now. There are a lot of famous examples of oneers. Some filmmakers do them better than others, of course. And then we actually know that there's no edits going on in there. And we're like, oh, wow, there are no edits in here. But we still don't really recognize that when there are a lot of edits. And there are quite a few film fans out there who would say there are too many edits in this scene, right? Or there aren't enough edits and I don't know where things are, what's happening, right? And that's part of the intuition that you're talking about. Like we have, at least as Westerners, we have this idea when we see a film that we can follow the story and we can follow the action, we can follow the progression of events. So what is that in filmmaking theory? What is that called?
So the idea in film theory, it's called cognitive film theory. The idea that it's similar enough to our perception that it's in some sense exploits our natural perception or the features of our natural perception
Sure.
to the point where it doesn't register consciously in a way. We just kind of let it flow along. So one of the interesting kind of experiments that has been done on this is the idea of edit blindness.
Okay.
And so this is the idea that we edits are invisible. You can't see them. And so even when students, subjects in experiments were told to look for, and even if the sound was turned off, they were told to look for edits. There were certain kinds of edits that they would miss like 25, 30% of the time. They couldn't even see them. There were other edits that were much more noticeable. If you turn the sound on, they notice edits a lot less. So sound tends to be something that complicates picture. And all filmmakers know this, by the way. This is something that every filmmaker kind of understands, that sound can help smooth out edits. And so that edit blindness that we experience in film is kind of a clue, right? It's kind of a clue that there's something going on here that's tricking us. If we can't even notice these edits. Imagine asking people, like, pick out every single word in this sentence, right? You'd be able to do that no sweat, right? But there are certain edits, maybe some, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because there is a test out there where you can give somebody a passage and you ask them to count all of the F's, and they'll forget all of the F's associated with with the word of. So I would say very similar to what you're describing right now.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that makes sense because the of is like a kind of semantic unit. And so it's just skipped over. Yeah,
it is absolutely skipped over. Yeah, which is fascinating in and of itself, but I think it fits with how you're describing participants not recognizing edits when they're there. It almost seems like, as one of your interview guests in the film, Walter Murch, describes this, just like the blink, right? And when I watched this part of the documentary, I was like, okay, well that's found in the literature, in the perceptual literature, and it's something that as a cognitive psychologist myself, we talk about very early on in the cognitive psychology and sensation and perception class, which is the idea of the attentional blink, how our attentional system is incapable of registering about 300-ish milliseconds of attentional shifts. And how fast would you say a 24 frame per second frame lasts?
1/24th of a second.
1/24.
Actually 1/48th of a second because there's black in between each of those. So yeah,
right.
1/48th.
1/48th of a second. Do you know what that is in milliseconds?
It would be what, 1,000? Oh, geez, no. I'm not gonna even try to guess.
Yeah, no worries. It is a very small number, right? It's
like
tens.
It's like 50.
It's 50, tens of milliseconds. And so, which is why a 24 frame per second movie is great. It's seamless, so to speak, right? And then you get up to 30 and it's great. You get up to 60 and it's like, wow, this is really smooth. But people didn't like when Peter Jackson did that for the Hobbit films, when he made them 60 frames per second. And we were like, we don't like this. And I was just reading a post about the soap opera effect on people's televisions and how it just looks goofy to a lot of people, because they soap operas were filmed in high light, high frame speed cameras. But I want to go back. I'm getting a little digressing there. Let me go back to the 24 frames per second. Anything slower than that, we get the sensation of seeing the frames, right?
Yeah.
Definitely.
You start to see flicker.
You start to see flicker.
Not so much flicker, but yeah, you see the individual frame. Everything looks choppy.
Choppy. But I mean, I think flicker is a great word, because the old film reels used to go a little bit slower. I mean, they're hand cranked. It's hard to do 24 frames per second on a hand crank there, and that's why they were called flicks, right? Because they flicker.
And what's going on there is you're actually seeing that black black frame in between each regular. And it's not necessarily a frame. It's not actually on the film, but it's a part where the film is being obscured by the shutter.
Yes.
And so. Yeah.
That's very true, because the shutter is opening and closing very quickly. And so when we get back to the attentional blink being about 300 milliseconds, right, where you lose that focus of attention for 300 milliseconds, anything faster than that, we're not going to register because it's too fast, right? So 1/48th of a second, tens of milliseconds, you aren't going to register that. And so taking this all the way back to the research that you just discussed, which was about not connecting with edits, right? Not seeing those edits,
no noticing,
unquote, not consciously aware of those edits. It's fascinating.
It's just so surprising. It's a small set of techniques that were developed over a period of 10 or 12 years still form the basis for cutting together a scene. But one of the fascinating things about early cinema is that it put filmmakers in the position of being sort of amateur psychologists. Through this series of informal experiments, cutting scenes together in different ways, filmmakers developed this really interesting intuition about the perceptual process. And that is a substantial proportion of time, people don't notice the edits. And the hardest edits to detect are called match action edits, where action in one shot continues across the edit, creating this illusion of continuity between shots.
Alas! I cannot claim this next feat as illusion.
And so in the process of developing cinema, filmmakers plugged into something deep about us at a perceptual level.
Watch carefully.
And created an art form that's almost effortless to understand.
So early on in film history, as you explore in The Cinema Within, you talk about a special kind of editing. And can you describe to the listeners what is meant by continuity editing?
Yeah, so continuity editing, when we're describing about the cut being invisible, continuity editing became the norm in Hollywood first and then throughout the world because it creates that impression of something that's invisible and easy to follow. So going back to the 1910s or so, this is when this format or this style was codified. Initially, it's actually so. I should start off by defining the techniques. So there's basically 5 or 6 techniques that are used. And each of these techniques was developed separately in separate films in the early 1900s, so the first decade of the 1900s. And then Hollywood eventually took these techniques and merged them into a system that worked really, really well. So the techniques are match on action. So match on action is a kind of edit where we would have a action starting in one shot, and then it continues in the second shot. So you cut at that moment where the action is taking place. And those are the kinds of edits that are most invisible. So like, for instance, if you have a baseball player throwing a baseball, you wouldn't cut before they've thrown the baseball. You wouldn't cut after they've released the baseball. You would cut from the medium shot of them throwing it to the close-up right in the midst of them throwing it. And what happens is an audience won't even notice that you've cut into the close-up most of the time.
That's so wild, right? Because obviously we cannot do that with our eyes. We can't change perspective. We're sitting in one seat, right? So that's match on action, right? And so we can intuitively, to use this word again, intuitively follow that the pitcher has gone into their windup and thrown the ball, and the edit is during the throwing, but we zoom in, so to speak, on the throwing action. And then where do we go from there?
Instantaneously, you've cut from into that close-up. And so, but the thing it's not that we intuit it in many cases, it's that we perceptually process it in a certain way. In some senses, psychologists believe that there's a mechanism of motion in the brain that it is exploiting. And so with that's why it feels so hardwired, right? It feels just like something that you almost can't see any other way. You can't interpret it in any kind of other way. There's only one way to interpret that, and that is the action is continued to the point where I don't even notice the cut. So that's one kind of cut. There's another kind of cut called an eyeline match. And an eyeline match is basically, you can imagine it. You've seen it. I mean, you'll see it in any number of TV shows or movies. Just watch for 2 minutes and you'll see one.
Right. I mean, I would say this one's the most common because people are always talking to each other.
Yeah, they're talking to each other or they're looking at things. And so this one is not necessarily talking to someone, but imagine somebody looking off screen. Cut to. So they look intently off screen. You have to hold for a split second as they look. And then you know that they're looking at something. Cut to another object and then cut back to that person still looking. And we get intuitively that, they're looking at that thing that they cut to.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Even though you haven't seen those things in the same space, oftentimes we will understand that immediately, right? And it's kind of functioning again on this kind of cognitive level where it's like, there's this kind of theory of mind idea where like you're kind of like trying to understand what that person is looking at when they're looking at something intently, and even more so if they point. If they point at something, you really want to know what's over there. And so what you're going to do is you're going to shift your attention over to that thing that they're pointing at. Right? It's very natural kind of thing.
I have a off the wall question for you about the eyeline match. How do, and I don't know if you've thought about this before, but I'll give you a little background for why I'm asking this question right now after having watched the documentary. So I'm watching Twin Peaks right now, and in David Lynch's glory, he had a bit of a soap opera feel to the show, and so a lot of actors. I could have drawn in any kind of example here, but because I'm watching Twin Peaks right now, this is my example. A lot of characters end a scene by staring off into the middle distance, right? So we've got the 1,000-yard stare, so to speak. So what makes the eyeline match different here as an editing tool to like where we don't actually care where they're staring because they're just staring off into the distance? What's the difference there? How do we know that it's one thing versus the other, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, because we don't cut to the actual thing that they're like staring off into the middle distance, right? And so like if we cut to that thing after they've stared for a long time, chances are we're going to perceive that as they're looking at that thing. But if they just stare off into the middle distance, we kind of get the sense that, oh, they're thinking about this. They're considering it. We're watching them think, right? So I think that's the difference, is that you don't actually have a cut that it goes to, and the music, and there's other cues that are there. The scene is kind of ended. And so it's a time for this character to kind of reflect. And so therefore we kind of hold on them reflecting.
Yeah. I mean, David Lynch does that a lot in the show. It's like 5 or 6 times per episode. I'm like, oh my God, I'm done with them thinking. Okay. All right. I appreciate the explanation on that one. What's the third technique?
Okay, so the third one is often considered a subset of the eyeline match. It's not necessarily, but we'll consider it for our conversation today. We'll consider it a subset of it. And this is what's called shot reverse shot. And so this is where you typically have a conversation. So you have one person looking off screen.
That's the conversation one. Got it.
Yeah, one person looking off screen. And critical here is that one person is looking left to right on screen, and then the other person is looking right to left on screen. So there's this kind of spatial understanding that we kind of seem to want to have, at least it is codified in the kind of conventional rules that says that if two people are looking at each other, they're going to be facing opposite directions. If they're going to be looking at the same thing, they're going to be facing the same direction, right, on screen. So they would both. If two characters are looking right to left, left to right, facing each other, and then all of a sudden one character turns away and looks in the other direction, we're going to understand, oh, they're looking at something that was originally behind them.
I see. And this works for like somebody in a room and then somebody walks in too, right? And their attention is drawn to the person walking into the room. They're still going to be reversed in that way.
Yeah. So like initially what'll happen is if a person comes into a room, we have the character looking, we would probably have a character look over to the door at first, and then character comes into the room, or vice versa. And then that becomes an eyeline match initially. But then it'll settle into a shot reverse shot as we bounce back and forth between the two as they talk. Now it's usually, like beginner editors will just like cut on the people talking. So person A talks, cut to person B talking, cut to person A talking. But actually what's most interesting about that is when you actually have the shot of the person responding to the person talking. That's when you kind of get involved with it, because then you see that person's wheels turning, right? That's when so it's not just acting isn't just about the performance that the character is giving. It's also about responding to that. Editing allows us to choose at what moments we want to cut back and forth between those two characters. And so you can really shape a scene and shape a performance using that technique.
I feel like this level of shot reverse shot editing has made its way into the YouTuber and streamer space, because I've noticed quite frequently that gamers will have their camera oriented. So listeners, I'm doing some camera stuff while Chad and I are talking, but like, so I'm which way am I facing right now, Chad?
On screen right now, you're right to left.
I'm right to left, right? And so I will put my little, webcam, face cam on the game. So I'm looking at the game, right? So it'll, depending on where my camera is, like, stationary, I will be looking at the game with, so my viewer thinks that I'm like looking at the game along with them, right? So it's like sort of eyeline match and shot reverse shot kind of role playing in there. And I don't think anyone has like analyzed that, but I'm pretty sure a lot of gamers are doing that these days without any formal training. So again, an aspect of intuitiveness that like this makes sense and I should be doing it. And again, going back to the editing, this makes sense. This is how we should have this scene play out.
Yeah, no, I think there's something to that idea of a recognition that this is the way that feels right. Now, that one could say that they've learned that through like media saturation, just watching things. They kind of intuit those kind of internal rules, and I think that that's probably the case when I made a match in action for the first time. I did it accidentally when I was first sitting down to edit and didn't even know what I was doing, and I made one and it was like, wow, that looks cool. That looks so real.
Yeah,
you know. And I recognize, chances are I recognized it from, my prior cinematic experience. And so it just like felt like a real movie at that point. And so, I think maybe there's something like that going on there where they're kind of expressing their media saturation in a way that this is the right way to do it.
The next technique that I actually don't understand, even watching the film, I've watched other film analyses on YouTube and elsewhere. Please, as best you can, what is the 180 degree rule?
It's really easy if you can draw it. So if I was able to draw an overhead schematic,
even with the visuals in the film, I'm still lost.
Okay, so let me explain what it's trying to solve, because I think that will hopefully make it clear. Right. So if you have two people in conversation, one is looking left to right on screen, another one is looking right to left on screen. Right. And as long as they maintain those same directions on screen, we're going to understand that they're looking at each other. We're going to understand the spatial relationship of that scene. But imagine all of a sudden if one character, and this happens in like movies all the time, where they have intentionally violated the 180 degree rule. Imagine that all of a sudden a character that was looking right to left on screen all of a sudden starts looking in the opposite direction, but we haven't seen their head turn. It's just like the camera has positioned itself to make them look like they're looking in a different direction now. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what the 180 degree rule is trying to keep from happening. So the way that you do that is you have these two characters looking at each other. So just imagine two people sitting at a table and imagine connecting their nose, looking at each other. Imagine connecting their noses with an imaginary line, a dotted line going between their two noses, right? Okay. That line, as long as you stay on one side of that line, you establish that line initially, and that's the 180 degree line.
Okay.
You got it.
The 180 degree rule is essentially for the camera. Am I understanding that right? Right. So like the plane of recording, so to speak, the plane of the visual space, as far as the depth plane is concerned, right? We've got this imaginary wall that we cannot go onto the other
Cross
side
over,
because then it will. Because if
change the orientation of the characters.
So so when a filmmaker violates, when an editor violates that rule, is this is a cut that we are like, we have a visceral reaction to? We're like, ooh, I didn't like what happened there.
Well, so it depends. It depends on context. Most of the time people will ride through it just fine because they'll be able to identify the character. They already knew what the character was looking at. But if you had two similar looking characters clashing, say for instance, you have two armies coming towards each other, right? And they're dressed similarly, right? And all of a sudden you violate that rule, then you're not going to know, well, who is going left to right, who is going right to left on screen. Right.
So there's certain circumstances where it's not like a golden rule, so to speak, that you shouldn't break. But then there are certain circumstances where it's like, if you violate it, you are going to confuse your audience.
Yeah, I think in most cases, it probably doesn't matter that much, but it can create, and it does create actually, a subtle psychological cue. So there's an internal cue in your brain that is there's a mechanism that's monitoring the spatial relationships, apparently.
Right.
And when the 180 degree rule is violated, there's something inside that like says there's something gone wrong here, and I need to kind of reset. And this gets deep into like event perception and those kinds of things, where all of a sudden you start doing a bunch of saccades, which is getting beyond what we've already talked about. But all of a sudden you start looking around real quick as if something new has happened when there's a 180 degree rule violation that you weren't doing before. So there is something going on that when I see one, I kind of feel it first.
Yeah.
And then I'll think,
do as well.
Oh, wait, where were they looking before? And then I'll think, oh, okay, that's what was going on. So there's something inside you that's telling you something has gone wrong. Yeah. And that's a kind of spatial awareness of the overall scene.
Yeah. And there are a number of theories that would get to this. Your explanation kind of fits in with earlier perceptual theories by J.J. Gibson, which essentially says that our visual space is constantly changing, but we are also changing. And broadly speaking, this idea sort of goes to the connection, why we have perception and why we don't have just sensation straight to movement, why we have this intermediate step of reinterpreting the information in our brain as opposed to just going straight from sensation to action. And that is, well, we have to navigate a world just like other things are navigating. And so I think violating the 180-degree rule in certain circumstances is a violation of regularity in the environment, because we know things that shouldn't move don't move, and when they do move, we're like, what the hell? Like, if it's a camouflaged animal, for example, that's coming out and like trying to attack us or something like that, and we recognize that as like a rock or something, maybe an armadillo, we'll say, a very rabid armadillo. It looks like a rock, jumps up at us, and we're like, holy crap, what is that? And then, we have to panic and do all of these other things. But before we recognize that it wasn't a rock, or it was a rock and now it's not a rock, we have that, I think, that unconscious internal mechanism that says something's off here that we need to reconcile. And yeah, how you described it is we're like, oh yeah, okay, this is what they were doing. We sort of go into our heads and we sort of move the pieces like a chessboard around in our heads until they're straight enough or they're in a position enough that makes sense, and then we can continue on with the action. So if it's violated in a relatively complex story, I think you're shooting yourself in the foot, right?
It depends, again, on the situation. And some filmmakers want to disorient you. There are certain situations where you want to be disoriented because the space of the scene doesn't really matter sometimes. Or like you can actually like make it so that, the feeling is what you're after as the filmmaker, as opposed to like a concrete understanding of people's, of the space of the scene. So there are ways to use it. But that said, the kind of vanilla approach of Hollywood for years has been to not violate that rule, because it does create this subtle kind of twinge of a feeling of something's not quite right here that most people ride through, but like it totally like Ang Lee's The Hulk uses it very purposefully throughout. There's other films that use it too. That's a kind of classic example.
Oh boy, that film. Oh boy. I have an opinion-based question for you. My question is, do you think the standard editing practices, continuity editing, all of this stuff, has led to the thing that's coming to mind is blandness?
Well, it's always been accused of that, even like into the 1920s and 30s, as it was being adopted worldwide. The Soviet filmmakers were rejecting it as something that was uninteresting, and they wanted to really kind of experiment. So it's always because it's the norm. But at a certain point, like you have to communicate with your audience, and so there's only so many different ways you could do it, but this is one that has proved very effective. And I honestly don't think continuity is your problem there if you're finding a film to be particularly bland. I think there's probably issues with the story, or
that's true. I just meant from a visual standpoint.
There's so many other things that you can do to spice that up. Now, in fact, David Bordwell, who's in the film and is now deceased, one of the great thinkers of this kind of thing, he talks about what's intensive continuity editing. So that's still using the continuity editing rules, but a much quicker pace, maybe some kinds of like subtle violations thrown in, maybe a few jump cuts here and there to like kind of spice things up. But like that kind of intensive continuity is more the norm within films, and it depends on the situation. So like oftentimes if you just have a conversation between two people, the best way to do it is just with two shot reverse shots going back and forth and just letting the performers do the job. Other times, if you have like a big action scene going on and you want to like an audience to kind of feel the scene, the intensity of the scene, then you can start throwing all these things at it. So there's all sorts of different ways. I mean, one of the reasons why this system has been around for so long, since literally the 1910s, is because it works and it's very flexible, and it gives filmmakers opportunities to adjust things in post-production, and audiences get it without any sort of problem at all.
We tend to, as a culture, I mean, especially with the explosion of technology in the last couple hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, we haven't spent a lot of time doing the same things over and over again. As far as art forms go, and I do, granted, recognize that films aren't just editing. Of course, there are awards for editing, and editors get their just desserts for that. But of course, there's costuming, there's storytelling, there's visual effects, blah, 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 right? So it is a vast art form. And I was just curious if filmmakers who don't spend a lot of time with continuity editing are sort of pushed to the sides because they want to change something, but it just doesn't fit the norm. So audiences aren't gonna get it, right? It's the line from Back to the Future. You may not like that, but your kids are gonna love it, or something. Whatever Michael J. Fox says as Marty when he's done with the Johnny Be Good segment, right? And I'm just curious because this over 100 years old technique, right? Since really the dawn of commercial filmmaking, right? The Lumiere brothers were just filming trains coming into stations and people walking around. There wasn't a lot going on, but like commercial filmmaking, like you said, 1910s. We are 100 years later, more than 100 years later, and it's still the same kind of technique. I'm just curious if people are going to get
we're
bored
static.
of it.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think that, certain kinds of discontinuity techniques have been incorporated into the standard style. So like back in the 1960s, early 1960s, when a film called Breathless came out, Jean-Luc Godard did jump cuts in that film where he'd just like literally have somebody on screen and all of a sudden it would cut out like a chunk of the film. And so he'd jump on screen and do it again and do it again. And it created this kind of intensity. Yeah. Well, that was incorporated into standard Hollywood storytelling relatively quickly. By the late 1960s, Hollywood films were using those techniques in certain scenarios. So there's certain kinds of edits that are effective if you did a whole film like that, you could. And filmmakers do, but those don't get out there too much because it's probably a little bit too much for most viewers.
Yeah, and I will say that a good example of editing that is not helpful / confusing to the audience on purpose is a film that I use a lot in my teaching, which is Christopher Nolan's Memento, which has the reverse chronological interspersed with the chronological aspects of the narrative. And what I split viewing over two class periods, and by the middle, the middle section after the first hour or so, I'm like, hey, how you guys doing? Because I know what the narrative is, and I've seen it a couple dozen times. How are we doing? This is the first time they see it, and they're like, I am so confused. and I said, that's on purpose. Yeah. So I like those opportunities to mess with it, but
so Christopher Nolan isn't violating continuity there.
True,
what you're talking about is like a larger story structure, as opposed to like continuity editing. And so like his films mostly like adopt the continuity style. I think it's important to remind people here what we're talking about is basically like what's called the fundamental grammar. So this is like so low level. This is so in many ways uninteresting. It's so bland because it's just like, it's like the word, like in language, it's just like, here's a word. It's made of letters put together. We put them in sequence to, you know what I mean? And like, but like, that's how you actually build up from that. You can't have a film without like considering those kinds of things. So these are like very low level techniques, the continuity techniques that we're talking about. This is not like some showy Christopher Nolan rearranging of time, which he does, which is incredible.
Yeah, that's true. I will grant that. Yeah. I guess I don't have a modern example floating around in my head
of a violation. Of a
violation,
continuity?
Yeah. So you mentioned Goddard and the old French avant-garde.
Well, watch any action scene now. Watch any action scene and you will see there'll be violations of the 180-degree rule thrown in there. There'll be jump cuts sometimes thrown in there, especially if the footage is made to look like news footage. So if it looks like video, so like if there's an alien attack and they throw in, like if you want something to seem real, then you actually throw in these jump cuts because that's how news would edit it. So it feels more real, right?
Oh, so the news would edit it that way. That's fascinating. Yeah. I didn't realize that. So is that true? News programs will edit action that way?
Well, that's a documentary often doesn't have the time or doesn't have the multiple angles in which to cut something together with continuity.
Yeah.
So you just cut together a bunch of shots together to kind of create some sort of semblance of an action taking place in the news because you don't have it fully covered. That's why you cover things with all these different camera angles in a Hollywood film. So that way you can cut it together fluidly and smoothly. But if you want in a narrative film, if you want something to feel kind of edgier, like taking place in real time, then, and it's and it's supposed to be intense, then you can use these techniques of discontinuity to create that impression.
Very fascinating. Is that why I get annoyed with fight scenes where I have no idea where people are in space and what they're doing in the fight? Are these discontinuity edits?
Probably. I mean,
oh god,
maybe to a certain extent the editing, but also probably just the way that it was shot in a certain way as well. But I mean, does it really matter where they're at? I mean, I think that's what the filmmaker would respond.
Fair.
Is my hunch. Like, who cares what the actual physical space is? All we need to know is that they're fighting and that they're using this weapon and whether it works or not, right?
Yeah, okay. I'll grant you that as a filmmaker, it's hard to know. It's hard to know what the filmmaker's going for when an audience member is watching it, and to use a phrase that we've been using, a discontinuous time, right, at some other future point, right. And there was one more technique that you wanted to mention that you put in your notes here. What was that technique, Chad?
So what's called parallel editing or cross-cutting.
Okay.
So this actually involves some sense of discontinuity in the sense that you're cutting to a new space. Just to give people an example that's probably comes to mind for a lot of people is imagine the ending of a Star Wars movie.
Okay.
Where you've got Darth Vader and Luke battling it out with lightsabers on the Death Star, and then you cut to the out in space, and you've got this battle scene going on out there to try to blow up the Death Star. And then down on the Endor moon, so we're talking about Return of the Jedi here, down on the Endor moon, you've got the Ewoks and Han Solo and Leia and all of them trying to get into the base to deactivate the shields, right? And so the second half of that film is basically cutting back and forth between these three stories.
Gotcha.
And at the end, as it climaxes, it starts to get a lot quicker.
Okay.
And that starts to become cross-cutting, where you're cutting between the three stories. But the understanding is that you do not show all of the action that's taking place down on Endor. You only show certain snippets, and you leave other snippets out that have taken place between time.
Okay.
With the idea that an audience will understand, oh, this is time flowing all together. If you showed all the action taking place during that time, then you would think, well, what happened to the time that should have been left out while I was watching it, right?
Right.
So
it would be the lull of people like waiting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're just kind of sitting around waiting for like to develop a plan, get an idea. And so like we don't need to show that, right? So like basically the idea is it creates this impression of a smoothly flowing time by leaving out certain bits.
Very good. I like it. Yeah. Another aspect of it too is you wouldn't want to show everything all at once for all of them. Not to incorporate the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, because then that would require like at least for your Return of the Jedi, we would have a rectangle
split screen.
We'd have a rectangle for the Death Star, we'd have a rectangle for space, and we'd have a rectangle for Endor, and it would just be like, who should I follow?
Yeah.
And
there's a movie like that called Time Code. You should watch if you're interested.
Oh
in
God,
like,
no, I hate it.
Four boxes.
No, I mean, I like it as a technique sometimes when you're like watching a heist movie, for example. But they do it in a way that like each rectangle draws your attention in a subtle way, so it's not necessarily a full crosscut. But it is like it's got the visual cues in each of them. So those are fine. But like, I don't understand how anyone could watch a multi-game setup for like soccer or football or whatever, where they have like all of the games on their single TV, and like, what are you supposed to focus on? So in a storytelling way, like you kind of need cross-cutting, right?
Well, in Time Code, what they do is they use sound to cue which box you're supposed to be looking at. So you use dialogue. So whoever's talking usually is the one that you're going to look at. But yeah, cross-cutting is just a very effective way to show two things taking place at the same time, especially if you're looking to build a sense of intensity.
Yeah.
So this was developed by Griffith. It was perfected by Griffith back in the 19-teens. And it became something that you can use in other parts of the film, but often it became the big climactic ending for the film because it's very intense as you go back and forth between the two. And rapidly, the speed of each of those little segments picks up, or rather, we're on them for a smaller length of time.
Yeah.
So the kind of apparent perception of the scene is one of increasing rapid pace as we're coming to a conclusion. It can be very, very exciting to cut back and forth between those, and it's no accident that Star Wars basically ends all the films in that style.
Yes, and I would say it works well for like bombs going off, or like a countdown, not bombs going off, but like a countdown for a bomb going off. And what hits my mind is like a lot of the climaxes for the Mission Impossible films. Not the most recent one being one of them, but the one before that, Rogue Nation, I believe it was. No, that wasn't it. And in any case, they have to disarm these nuclear weapons in like the far north tundra or whatever, and it cuts between one deactivation, another deactivation, and then Tom Cruise fighting, doing helicopter battles with Henry Cavill, and fighting on the side of a mountain, and yeah, it like there is a sense of urgency as one of those edits is always to the camera on the timer.
The clock, yeah. No, it's an old technique. I mean, that exact scenario that you're describing, minus Tom Cruise, was around in the 19-teens. That there are films that basically use the clock, the countdown, the deadline, and combine that with cross-cutting. It's incredibly effective.
In the 1970s, when the Turkish state was bringing some electricity to these mountains, they built villages down the hills, and they invited people to move these new houses without any cost. But some people didn't want to move in. Some of them wanted to stay there on top of the mountains. So they didn't have electricity for a very long time. These are the ones that didn't have any television at all and had never been exposed to any form of films before.
What I want to shift to in our conversation now is the role of the investigation. So in this documentary, which I love, you have several researchers, and quite a few of them are based in psychology, right? You've got a neuroscientist in there, you've got a cognitive psychologist, and I would call Sermin one of perhaps your documentary main character, protagonist, if you will, on the psychology side. I don't know necessarily what she would call herself in psychology, but looking at her body of work and where she's at now, at least, I would say firmly in cognitive science somewhere, right? So would you describe for us the setup, the narrative from the Cinema Within regarding the investigation of continuity editing and the theory of cognitive editing, and what her investigation was and how she went about it?
So basically, the question that she's trying to answer is continuity editing so pervasive and so long-lasting because it is something that we intuitively and innately understand because we're the creatures the way we are? Mm-hmm. Or is it something that is learned, right? So this is basically a nature versus nurture kind of setup.
Exactly.
And so if you're going to run an experiment of this kind of thing, the best way to do it is to look at people and compare people who have seen movies before and have been enculturated into movies and been educated just by watching them, and people who haven't seen movies before. That would be a very effective experiment if you could find people who haven't seen movies before. Right. But that's pretty hard. Now, of course, children, many of them haven't seen movies up to a certain point, and so you could do them, but they aren't fully cognitively developed yet.
Nor catching them early enough, verbal enough, I think, to explore the kinds of work that Sermin, and her full name is Sermin Ildirar, and she explored this with adults. And
yes,
in really a small village in Turkey, correct?
Correct. Yes, she was able to locate people who had never seen films before. Now, not everybody in that village was film literate. Some people had seen films, but people who generally tended to be up in the hills in this village in Turkey, those people at that point, some of those people, in fact, quite a number. I think she found ultimately like 50 in her initial control group, in her initial group.
That's so wild to me because you're in this ostensibly developed nation. Yeah, there are rural villages out there, and there's rurality in a lot of developed nations, of course. But that the fact that she was able to find this many people in Turkey is astounding to me. And I'm sure all throughout the world you can find film illiterate people that might like shoot you with arrows. And I'm specifically talking about the Sentinel tribe in Southeast Asia that wants no contact with the people. They would be perfect for this experiment, but want nothing to do with others.
Yeah. And she actually did find a group of nomadic people in eastern Turkey.
Interesting.
Who also hadn't seen films before, but they didn't want to have anything to do with her experiment. So she went and found other people up in the mountains.
Okay.
Southern Turkey.
That an astounding dissertation endeavor, I want to say. Like, my dissertation has pales in comparison to the amount of work she was doing for it.
Yeah, and we should specify the years here too. This is about 2009, 2010. That those kind of years is when she's working, and she's working in conjunction with a professor named Stefan Swan from who's in Vienna, I believe, or thereabouts.
Okay,
and so he was her doctoral advisor. But Sermin located the people, and then she ran the experiments. And the experiments, I mean, so what she's basically trying to do here is to show these people examples of basic film edits, people who haven't seen films before, and see if they interpret them in the same way that we would interpret them, or in the case of Sermin, in the same way that her control group did. She found other people in that same area who had been exposed to films, and she asked them the same kinds of questions. And so that was the real question that she was attempting to answer.
And a phenomenal question too, on its face, right? Somebody interested in film, somebody interested in the cognitive science of it, sort of meeting there, but has this really critical and foundational problem of finding the right people to do it. Quite resourceful. And the fact that she and Sermin is Turkish and was able to communicate with these rural residents, what appeared to be, absolutely fine. And might I add, which you use in your film, The Cinema Within, filmed herself while she was doing this.
Yeah, and so the recordings, so you actually see in this movie people who have never seen films before, which I thought would be one of the pleasures of watching this film. And you get to see them see movies for the first time. Yeah. And their response was, initially like a lot of them were like laughing or like smiling. Yeah. Just like, it was like kind of a childlike wonder at what am I seeing here,
And I think that's, I don't want to say universal, but I think that there is a long history of this, especially around the turn of the 20th century, where film cameras were becoming more ubiquitous, especially whether they were, single shot film cameras or they were, movie film cameras. And then people just seeing what they look like, capturing their soul, so to speak. And really the only thing that they could muster is laughter, not horror, not anger, but laughter and giddiness. It's quite remarkable when you think about it, when like people were saying, heavily religious folk were saying at the time, like you're stealing people's souls by taking a photograph of them. Like you're relegating them to hell because you've stolen their soul. No, people look at it and they would just smile and laugh. And I did very much enjoy seeing that in your film.
And they were, it should be said that they were familiar with the concept of television and, moving images. It's just they hadn't experienced them. And some of them may have caught like a little bit, passing through somebody's house or whatever. Okay. But like in terms of like a kind of daily experience, that was something that was foreign to them. But they understood. And in fact, she asked them, what do you think this will look like? Or what do you think television looks like? And they would say, it's kind of like radio with pictures is what they said, because they were familiar with radio.
Yeah.
And so they listened to radio quite a bit, but like, they just imagined it was kind of like a picture version of radio, maybe like a slideshow is probably what they were thinking of, because they were used to photographs, right? Yeah. They had photographs in their homes. And so they probably imagined kind of like a PowerPoint presentation. And so, when they saw it, and then of course they saw people from their village. So what Sermin did was she showed them, she made these examples. She didn't just take films from like a Hollywood feature or whatever. She wanted them to be familiar with the not necessarily the individuals, but at least like the things that were going on, the environment. Right. If you put something so foreign in front of them, they would be distracted by that. They wouldn't be able to kind of like actually do the experiment. And so she wanted to do this. So she created basically 2-shot films. They were just like 2 shots most of the time. There's one that was like longer, but most of the time it was just one shot. Let's say a person looking at something and then cut to a tree, and that's it. And she showed them that, and she basically asked them, "What do you see? What is it that you're looking at? Or what did you just see?" Yeah. And then what you and I would say is, well, that woman is looking at that bird in that tree, right? We would know that intuitively. And so that was the question that she was posing to them.
Her initial results indicated what about these participants?
Well, it was kind of checkered. So it wasn't as simple. So you should understand, first off, Sermin anticipated that this would work going in. She wanted to know, like any good scientist, but she also had a hypothesis that this would actually turn out to be 100% positive.
Right, and so to describe what her hypothesis was here, she hypothesized that these folks would have an inherent understanding of these edits, correct? Am I?
Yes, an inherent understand. I think maybe even more precise would be that an inherent understanding that corresponds to our understanding.
Yeah, right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes. So a universal as far as we can measure it, I suppose.
So basically, this person is looking at that tree.
Yes.
It's as simple as that. And that's the kinds of edits that we're talking about here. It's that simple. This is the basic language of film that allows us to understand, what's going on in a film. So, would they, without any experience, understand these kinds of things? And if they did, then it's a pretty good sign that filmmaking is, this kind of editing is immediately intuitive. You'd have to say that that's for sure. Yeah. And then probably the corollary of that is because it's attuned in some sense to our perceptions.
Attuned to our perceptual architecture in the way that the brain gets information and analyzes that information, which all, at the very least, takes time. I say this like many times a semester in both cognitive psychology and sensation and perception courses. It all takes time. Yes, light travels at the speed of light, which is very, very fast, but it slows down when it reaches your retinas because it has to get transformed into biochemical energy. It has to travel distances, right? And so all of this processing takes time. And that is the key feature here, right? Because an edit is 50 milliseconds or so, right? Below the threshold of our cognitive awareness. We do not detect those things. As you said earlier in the program, we fail to detect lots of different kinds of edits. Even when we're told that they're there, we still may miss it. And I think it's really critical here to mention that Sermin's hypothesis fit with existing cognitive principles at the time, right? If American audiences can't, with previous research, can't detect these edits, and they're not film illiterate, well, if they can't detect these edits, then why should people who are film illiterate detect these edits or understand what these edits are trying to say or do or be? And I think that's a really critical background for her hypothesis. She didn't just go, I think people just understand film intuitively. Like, she had to actually go deeper than that into the cognitive literature, into the perceptual literature, and really nail down that this is how our brains work. This is how our sensational systems work, right? This is how our eyes work.
Yeah, no doubt. And Sermin's lit reviews are incredible. Like she's very clear whenever she's like defining the literature ahead of time, like here's what's been said, here's what's been thought. So yeah, all of this was kind of supported by a body of research, largely in the field of what's called cognitive film theory. And that underlying, and then there's a substrata of that for cognitive theory in general, cognitive perception, all sorts of things. Right. And so this was not just something that she made up, no doubt. And is this learned, or is this something that we intuitively get? That's what she was basically trying to understand.
And I think a related example, is Eleanor Gibson's research as far as, is depth perception learned or is it innate? And she did the visual cliff literature in the 1950s and 1960s. Married to, by the way, J.J. Gibson, who I mentioned earlier. They were both towers in the field of early perceptual cognitive research. So she did the visual cliff research, and she was able to discovered that, babies as young as 6 months old will not cross a visual cliff because they have what appears to be an innate sense of depth perception. If they have two working eyes, of course, two working normal or corrected to normal vision, right? They will be very hesitant. And the few babies that do cross the visual cliff are visibly upset when they're grabbed by their mother. They're like, why the hell did I just do that? What did I do? This is below me. It's like last Indiana Jones and Last Crusade and the Walk of Faith across the visual illusion bridge by Indiana Jones. Is why would I do that?
Yeah.
It's crazy. Why would I do that? Right. But most of them didn't.
They were They were sitting on plexiglass, and they underneath them, like they were just like kind of floating in air, and they were disturbed by the fact that like they shouldn't be
even
happening.
with their mothers, like big smiley faces, right? We get a lot of emotional cues early in our life from the people around us. How should we react to X, Y, and Z? Well, let me look at my models, right? And that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough. It was like, I'm floating on air here. How am I floating on air? But the vast majority of the babies did not cross the cliff and would not cross the cliff. Try as their mothers might, would not do it, right? So this idea of is the editing in films learned, right? Opposite to the conclusion that Eleanor Gibson found, or is it innate, right? And we can go back and forth about what is and what isn't learned. But I want to leave some mystery here for the progression of Sermin's research, because it's really interesting.
I think what working in this area for decades now has taught me is how little we actually know about perception. I had always assumed that the continuity we have from the real world, continuity of space and time, will automatically be mapped onto film. So even with minimal cues to how they related, people would fill in the gaps and they'd say these two separate images must relate. But it seems to be that the naive viewers didn't have that assumption. So I was completely blown away when I first saw Sermin's experiments, because the sense was that there's so much exposure to TV, the internet, smartphones, that you're not going to find anybody who hasn't seen it before. Even in the earliest days of cinema, there's all this context which would have biased how viewers interpreted it. She didn't say what she was going to show them, she didn't prime them, she didn't give them any expectation that they're going to see a narrative or something that should be stitched together. She just showed them and said, tell me what you see. So when we crossed paths at a conference, I had so many questions for her.
You mentioned earlier, Chad, about sound. Give us a little taste, just a little taste. Keep it vague as much as you can, about the role that sound plays in these kinds of edits.
Yeah, sure. So basically, first of all, think about like match on action and why that works, right? It works because you have something continuing over the edit, right? It's called continuity editing for a reason. There's the action that continues across the edit, and that helps us understand it. Well, sound works in a similar kind of way. Sound is something that you can have. You just put a sound of a bus going underneath an edit, and all of a sudden, like if it's at the front of the edit and it's at the tail of the edit, it'll smooth out that edit. We'll understand because we're getting this audio information that tells us that there is a continuous reality out there, and it will help make that visual edit maybe a little bit less overt to our eyes. And
I thought about it this way, like, say you go to a forest, right? And it's a very lively forest. It's during the summertime, so everything's active, right? We've got bugs, we've got birds, we've got other kinds of sounds, maybe a flowing creek or something like that, right? And you go into the forest and you close your eyes. So no more visual sensations, right? You close your eyes, but you can still hear everything that's happening. And you can, and of course, our auditory system is set up to where, and our ears and all of that is set up, quote unquote, evolved to allow us to determine where sound is coming from, what direction, where is it where is it? Is it above us? Is it below us? Blah, 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 right? The kinds of information that you get from sound is different from the kinds of information that you get from vision. And I think that goes along with what you're saying here. And I want to share another example, sort of like a related example, like I did with the visual cliff, is, Chad, are you familiar with the McGurk effect?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's
really cool.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And it fools everyone all the time. And one of the questions is, well, why does the McGurk effect work? So if you're not familiar, listener, the McGurk effect is the changing of sound to your perception based on sound alone, regardless of what lips are, or based on what the lips are doing, what the lips of what somebody is saying when the sound has not changed. So ba and fa are good examples, right? An FA sound and a BA sound, right? This is going to have different lip movement. So you look at somebody saying ba or fa and you can see them. But if you just play ba over somebody who is doing the F, so which is teeth to bottom lip movement, it will still, the ba will sound like fa. has a very bad description of the McGurk effect. It works obviously better with a visual medium, but we don't have that. So you'll have to take my word for it. And the reason why this works is because sound travels a lot slower than light does. And so we get the visual information before, like, again, we're talking milliseconds before the sound information comes into our ears. And so we see that the lips are making the F sound, or at least appearing to make the F sound, I should say. And so the audio that comes in our ears, even if it's a ba sound, makes that fa sound to us, because we're like, well, of course they're making the fa sound. Their lips made that movement. That's right. And of course, the McGurk effect only works with certain sounds and certain lip features. But it really goes to show that there is a different perceptual space, as Chad was describing, for vision and for sound. And I think that's what changes the interpretation of those edits. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, no doubt. Because I mean, I think one of the big things about vision is that it's disrupted. So sound is relatively continuous. You don't have blinks. You don't have what are called saccades, which saccades are tiny eye movements, or sometimes pretty dramatic eye movements as your eye kind of analyzes a scene. It goes back and forth, and it's constantly doing that. You don't realize that until you've seen video of someone, and especially like close-up video of the eye, just how many they're doing. They're doing like 3 times per second. Your eye is moving around, and yet you experience reality as this kind of static scene that exists in front of you. But that's all an illusion created by your mind. Your eye is like going around like crazy all the time. So, our life is full, our visual life is full of disruptions, much like edits in a film. And sound is one of those things that kind of concretizes it in a non-disruptive way.
It's wonderful that we figured out how to do this as human beings. And cinema, or audio visual, the blending of the two media, has only been around for 130 years or so, 140, we'll say. And I think it's amazing.
Sometimes when you're working, especially with something that you love doing, you lose a sense of time.
So it's about 5 o'clock in the morning. I walked out to get some breakfast. And I walked past the Christian Science bookstore. And they had the opening page of the Christian Science Monitor with an interview with John Huston on the cover of it. And he was talking about his film experience. And in particular, as an example of some other point he was making, he was attacking the use of a pan as a point of view.
As a rule, the camera is the protagonist. You enter the scene through the camera's eyes.
And when would I want the pan?
Only when that intervening space, the relationship between those objects, one on one side of the room and the other on the other, is important. If it isn't important, you cut.
And so what you're doing when you walk into the room and pan, which is to say somebody comes into the room, there's a party going on, the person comes into the room, and that happens. But it isn't like reality. Do that sometime, he said. Come into a room and get hit with a new scene, and you find that you will not do that. What you'll do is you'll do that, 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 and that. That the head moves, and it stops momentarily, takes a picture, and then moves again, takes another picture, and he said, Houston,
it has a physiological function, the camera. For instance, let's take the cut and the psychology of the cut, the physiology of the cut. Try this little trick yourself. Look at that lamp in one corner of the room, its extreme left. And now look back here at this lamp. You've done a complete right angle.
Right.
Now do it again. Now do it once more. You notice doing that, you blink your eyes.
Right.
You blank it out, because there's no point in viewing all this to come over here. That's a cut.
I see.
And to end our discussion here, and I don't know if you thought I was going to forget about it or not, but along with this, great segues is all I do. You have this great little tidbit, and probably something that you didn't have to do to get your point across in the film. As I said before, you have a great editor on the film. His name is Walter Murch, and he's won Oscars, correct?
No doubt.
Yeah.
Yes, multiple.
And he's been around for a while.
Yeah, he had. I mean, just to give the audience context, I mean, he did the sound on the Godfather movie.
Okay, there you
he
go.
edited with others. He edited Apocalypse Now. That's what he won one of his Oscars for.
Okay.
And then he had other films in the 80s and 90s like that everybody knows, but like his most well known are those for sure. Working with Coppola.
Yeah, and well deserved editing for Apocalypse Now. If you haven't seen that movie, you should get on it. I mean, it's tragic, of course, and it might take a couple of sessions, but definitely one on your list if you haven't gotten there yet. I mean, it's been around for a while, so I don't know if you haven't. But you interviewed him in 2019, straight on camera.
Mm-hmm.
But you have this couple of sequences in the film where you have a ostensibly younger looking dude, who sounds like he's talking like Walter Murch. And at first I was like, oh man, this guy has a deep voice. And then you bring it on a little bit later that wasn't the young guy talking. It was actually Walter Murch as a young guy from the 1980s. And he went and he did a lecture in Australia, was it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And the lecture became a book, which is kind of amazing on its face. How little work do you have to do to get a book out of something? It's quite good. I wish I could do that.
Yes.
And so you edit together. So I think this is our segue into like the joy of post-production and editing and like putting things together that we mentioned in your introduction. Like you had this other person sort of pretend to be Walter Murch from those recordings, and how amazing that you were able to get the original recordings. And you did this stylized reenactment for the documentary. So please share with us your vision for this, why you decided to do this, and like the aspects of it that you were able to put it all together.
Yeah, well, it's been done before in documentaries.
Sure.
There have been several other documentaries that have used this technique. But basically what you do is you create an edit, you create a podcast out of Walter Murch talking.
Okay.
You assemble that in, you do your audio editing in the best possible way to get him down to be as concise and whatnot.
Yeah.
And then at that point, you bring in an actor and you have that actor lip sync. And that actor has to lip sync really well to make it seem realistic.
Yeah.
And he does a great job. In fact, it was kind of mesmerizing watching him sitting there performing as Walter Murch. Because it's weird because the sound was coming from the side of the room.
Uh-huh.
And so there's this weird kind of like thing where it should be coming from him because his lips are moving. It was a weird kind of McGurk effect thing.
Absolutely.
Where like his lips are moving and it's just like it kind of synced together, but the sound was coming from the other side of the room as he's talking. So it's this weird kind of psychological space that it put you in. But the audience, like we had an audience sitting there for part of it watching him, and they were just like sitting there like, what's going, like some of them didn't even know like that I had set this up. So they were like, why is his voice, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like they were kind of confused as to what was going on. And so, but yeah, no, that was, the reason why is because you had to have some sort of visual. And I felt that this was a good way of reenacting this lecture that he's giving to demonstrate some of these techniques that we're talking about in the film, some of the continuity techniques.
Yes.
So as he talks about one of those techniques, then I can demonstrate it on screen.
Yes. Yeah. It's very good visual storytelling for sure. I enjoyed it. And so he's lip syncing. So he wasn't saying any of the, like he didn't like, I'm assuming he learned his lines, but he wasn't saying them out loud. Like you didn't just cut out that audio track.
Yeah. So like, I think most of the things he actually did say out loud.
Okay.
It's been so long. But I suspect that, he was actually talking with Murch. But obviously we didn't use the audio track from the camera. We used the original recording audio.
Yeah.
So,
And that's something that you would be doing in like, an editor, as opposed to like trying to finagle that with any sort of thing real time. Cause that would be a nightmare. That would be a nightmare. Oh my God.
Why would you? Why would
exactly.
you? Yeah, no, it's just like,
I've got
if
all
you've got
these
post-production, just use it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. What is your film editing program of choice?
I use Premiere.
Okay.
So I like the Adobe suite. I've used After Effects for and Premiere to a certain degree, but After Effects is something that I wouldn't give up. So I'm locked into the Adobe ecosystem.
Okay. I use Premiere Pro as well. And that's because I have a subscription for the Adobe suite, but I'm recording myself and your backup audio through Audition right now, and that's where I use for my DAW, my digital audio workspace, and this is like inside baseball for the rest of the listeners. But I love the aspect of using the stylized reenactment to really hit that lecture and to like intersperse it too with the real merch, face on camera, which is so good because you can actually, unfortunately, hear the aging in his voice, right, which is about 3 decades or so later, and you can tell that did they get a young Walter Murch? Did they record? Did they have a video recording of this and then just did a digital restoration on it or something? That's what I first thought. You synced the Murch audio with this actor speaking really well. And it wasn't until I think the second time that he appeared on screen that I was like, oh, okay, he's not actually verbalizing some of these things, because there was a little different inflection here and
little
there.
hiccup.
Yeah. But
that's mostly due to him. You can make some adjustments.
That's not my fault as the editor.
No. I mean, in terms of the quality of it, like that. I mean, he was doing it so well and so consistently. The actor was doing most of it, but then if he got a little bit out of sync, then I could go ahead and speed up the video or slow down the video to make it match the audio,
which is
a little bit.
Quite amazing, right? You don't. It's the fact that you can separate the two things and make them work in two ways. And this is a hint, by the way, for the rest of Sermin's research and collaborating with some of the other folks that you have on, some of the other cognitive or other researchers on there. I love what you do in one of the later scenes, talking about some of the initial results of the Turkish participants, and you put them, all 3 of them, in what would be considered the same space, even though I doubt they were all in the same space, right? They were all
right.
differently organized, but you, as a director, you directed, hey, look to your left or look to your right.
Yeah, so we basically there's a point in the real life story where 3 of our psychologists met and discussed the results of these experiments. And so in order to reenact that, I actually had each of these people, when I interviewed them, on a green screen.
Yep.
And I had them play pretend act with 2 people sitting around them. And the way that you do that is you have them look off screen in one direction, say some words, and then look off to the other screen and say some words. I recorded each of these individually, kind of knowing how it would turn out. Like, just like pretend if you're talking to Dan, how would you say to Dan about these results or whatever? Yeah. And then, like when I went to interview Dan, I would have Dan respond to that. And so, that's the magic of film editing, is each of these reenactments were shot months apart. And yet you can take those things, drop out the green screen, put in a background in a cafe, put in some sound of the cafe, and all of a sudden it starts to kind of feel a little bit real. It kind of looks real. And so, that was another technique. One of the techniques that I used for Murch that I think was actually pretty novel, I don't think I've ever seen this done before, was when I interviewed Walter Murch, I had him talk directly to the camera, right? So I shot it kind of what I might call poor man's Errol Morris, where people are just looking directly, addressing the camera.
Right, fourth wall breaking,
but when I
so
asked,
to speak.
Exactly, and so it's like he's talking to you. And so, but whenever I would ask Walter Murch a question, I didn't want to sit behind the camera. So I'm most of the time I'm just sitting behind the camera. You just see these eyes just looking at you, looming over the camera as they're being interviewed. But then when I would ask him questions, I would lean over to the side so I could actually, I'd look normal instead of just like behind the camera, right?
Sure.
So I just lean over to the side. And so I got a lot of images, probably about 30 minutes of Walter Murch just sitting there looking off screen, right? So if you can imagine what that would look like, he's looking at the camera when he's talking. But then when I start asking the question, he just sits there and nods and looks off screen and does all these things, looks around the room, etc. So I used those outtakes of him just looking off screen to create a recreation of him actually editing the conversation while he's talking about editing the movie The Conversation.
Wow.
Okay. So a shot of him looking off screen, I would cut with that a shot of an old flatbed editor, what they used to edit films on. So cut to a flatbed editor, cut to him looking at it, then cut him looking down, then cut to the buttons on the flatbed editor, then cut back to him. And it looks like he's actually manipulating this machine as he's talking about manipulating this machine. And I've never seen that done before, using outtakes from an interview where someone, you're using that to basically construct a scene. And so I thought that was an interesting choice.
Yeah, I think so.
on that filmmaker's part.
Now that I'm thinking back on it, I mean, I'm going to watch it again for sure to grab some clips for the show, but I thought to myself, I think sort of an initial thought that I had to myself was, that's strange. Or like I was initially, so this is sort of like the exact opposite of like continuity editing, even though like the reaction, like that makes sense. Obviously it's his hand on those things, but I was like, did Chad really have him do? Like I was concerned that Walter was doing work while being interviewed. I guess is what I thought.
Well, the illusion was so great.
Yeah,
then. See that just
exactly.
And nothing special that I did. I was just using basic setups on this thing and using very, very basic continuity techniques that we talked about. And yet it feels like when you're watching, like he's sitting there doing work as he's actually talking.
So I have a question
so
for you.
That shows the power of it.
I have a question for you then. So on IMDb, you have your cast, right? So in these scenes, Cliff Froelich is those are Walter Murch's hands?
Those are not Walter Murch's.
Okay.
Or that's Cliff's hands.
Cliff's hands. We're right.
And then,
but his quote unquote, I've got bunny ears going on right here. Those were his hands pressing buttons on your flatbed editor. Is that how you did it?
Yes. Okay. So I shot Cliff pressing buttons. I shot Ed, who bears from behind bears a resemblance to Walter Murch, and so I shot him from behind with the machine in front of him as the kind of wide shot.
Interesting.
And then I cut all those together. To make it seem and yeah, I think it's pretty seamless. I mean, why wouldn't it be? It's continuity editing.
It makes it work. Just a fun fact before we end here. I saw the name Ed Hansen pop up. One of my good friends is Ed Hansen, but he is SEN instead of SON. And I was like,
different dude.
Oh, yeah. It was immediate. I was like, this is a minuscule, like a millisecond of like, whoa, wow, really? No, okay. Anyways,
different guy.
Amazing.
I've met them both, a different guy.
Very good. Well, I want to thank Chad Freidrichs for joining me to discuss his documentary, The Cinema Within. Before we say goodbye, Chad, where can folks find this documentary?
So we have a website. It's cinemawithin.com.
I'm going to link that in the show notes, folks. But go ahead.
Yeah, so we have it's just like a Watch Now page. If you just go to the Watch Now page, it'll have all the links to the various formats. So, you can watch it on Vimeo, you can watch it on Amazon. We have it on Canopy. So if you have Canopy either through your public library or through your academic institution, you can watch it for free.
That's great.
But any one of those works great. So
and listener, I've looked through the website a little bit, and there is a page for how to use it in an educational setting, right? Not just watching it through Canopy in an educational sense, but like ways to use the information here. And I'm certainly going to incorporate it into my Sensation and Perception course coming up this fall. So really great timing, Chad. Really great timing. And so I want to thank you again for reaching out to me, letting me watch the documentary, and having this chat with you. It's been great. And I hope the best for you with this and your future projects.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I try to stay busy on other projects. I've got multiple ones going ahead. And so, constantly kind of fighting the battle of trying to stay alive in this industry and, produce good work. So, but I appreciate you having me on. It was really a lot of fun. I love talking about this, but I really love talking about it from this angle. It's not something that you get too often. It's a kind of in-depth kind of psychological approach from your interviewer. And so thank you for your time today.
You bet. And again, I appreciate your time. And that's going to do it for this episode. Until the next one, thanks for listening.